everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Teens Uncharted No Cap. JK, Teens Uncharted is my company. Teens No Cap is the podcast. So, gotta get that right today. Anyway, welcome back to Teens No Cap. I'm your host, Charity Chafee. I'm a licensed mental health counselor specializing in the treatment and support of teenagers, their parents, and the providers that work with them in private practice. Actually, in all the spaces, because I think there should be no shortage of support for people who are working with teens in therapy or in other areas. So, I was supposed to have a guest today, but I think something got mixed up, which is totally fine. It happens. We all live life. So I thought I would just hop on because I've had this idea in my head kicking around for a little bit. And it actually stems from when I worked in residential, when I was working in higher levels of care. So when we're talking higher levels of care, we're often talking about like hospitalization, something called an ICBAT and a CBAT. Those are community-based acute treatments in Massachusetts. There's also like partial programs, things like that. So there's lots of different levels of care that exist. But I was contemplating this and thinking about it because when I first started in residential, there was something that came up a lot when we were talking about care and motivation, goals, all these things. And when you're hearing people's stories, sometimes for teens, there is a disconnect or like a difference between the way that they have like stated something or their recall of it to like the family system and vice versa. So part of our job in like the higher levels of care was really trying to understand like how accurate of a reporter was this teenager. And that was something that I think that we don't talk enough about in terms of like, how do we understand and give value to different narratives that are within a family system, particularly with maybe a teenager who has a very different reporting style, reliability, etc. So when I think about this concept in terms of a family system, in terms of a teenager, I'm really looking for their reliability in terms of like how consistent is their storyline between one session to the next, how consistent is the reporting of that with word usage, etc. Is that something that showcases, if there's a shift in that, is that something that showcases their growth and change and development, or is it something that kind of like, you know, they're finding like new genres or like niches of it that they need to explore, or is it something that like there's actually an inaccuracy in what they're reporting, meaning like maybe it didn't happen the way they thought it did, or there's like new details they haven't told us about, or there's influence from kind of outside parties. So when I think about reliability in terms of a teenager, I often think about the family system in terms of like a reliable reporter. And I conceptualize that based on, is there a shared narrative for the things that are happening, either for that teen or for the family in the system? And I think it's important to talk about a shared narrative because there is nobody that's right or wrong exclusively in a family system. Not the parents, not the teen, not like the younger kids, not, grandpa, right? There is nobody that is exclusively correct, accurate, right all the time. And then in a family system, it's never about right or wrong. It's about how do we come together with a shared narrative and understanding where things are, what the problem is, how do we associate and assign different things, values, accountability, responsibility, etc. So when I'm working with a new teen, I want to get a lay of the land. So I want to know how they report, how they discuss, how they talk about historical occurrences in the family, current things that are happening in the family. And then I also want to like see how the parents are talking about those and see kind of like what comes up with it, right? And we absolutely know that, sorry, it's a little chilly in my office, so I'm turning my heater on. It's like 60 degrees in Massachusetts right now, and I love it, but it makes my toes a little cold. Anyway, we know in a family system that everyone is going to have different perspectives, right? And when you're working with a teen and you're working with their family, it is so incredibly important to make sure that you are not dismissing anyone's perspective on what happened or where we're going. All of those perspectives have value, whether it's just adding to the conversation in terms of here's an idea, or if it's a lens that we can kind of look through it with. all of those perspectives give us an additional understanding with more questions, with more things we can explore and, dig deeper, etc. So when we're talking about a shared narrative, we're really talking about like, do the people in the family that experience that event or that situation or experiencing whatever's happening right now, do they experience it similarly in terms of like facts, in terms of, specific details, etc.? Because that gives you a lot of information on where the family unit is at, right? Do they already have a shared narrative? Because that is a much different situation than a family who potentially has narratives that are all over the place, right? Everything is like very scattered. And this is one reason why I really love narrative work, is because I think that it's really valuable to understand that every storyline has value and different things, different concepts, different questions we can ask ourselves, different areas to learn. And so when I'm working with a family, I want to understand where all those narratives are, what value that narrative has on the parents, the teen, whatever. What could be the protective feature of that narrative? And again, it's not about right or wrong. It's not about someone being off base, but it is about like, what is that narrative about and why, right? Why does that thing exist? How are we here right now with potentially such a scattered narrative between members of the same family? So when I start working with a teen and their family, I want to understand what sort of shared narrative we have, and I want to understand what the protective factors are for people and their personal narratives in that situation. And then the goal is actually not to correct anyone's narrative, right? The goal in family therapy is to encourage everybody to put their narrative out there and have discussions and to show honesty and accountability and support. And you may end up in a space where the shared narrative is knowing that you have different perspectives and different interests and different motivation for those things. And it's not about getting on the same page and agreeing, right? It's not about this is right, this is wrong, etc. It is entirely about, how do we get on the same page? What does that page look like? How big is that page? Right? There's all these like really cool concepts you can introduce, but I think that there is this huge process of dismissiveness when I'm working with a teenager and I'm working with parents and family systems, and it's not necessarily intentional. So parents, this is not a jab at you. I just think, you know your kid for so long that you create kind of like assumptions, you create narratives, you create these situations or these thoughts, and I think that they have value, but I also think if we are not checking those things with the teenager, with the kid, with the other parent, it becomes this thing that kind of festers within you and isn't something that's like really out there with your kid in the family system, with a provider, etc. So when we're talking about creating a shared narrative, we need to understand all the different components of the family and who has a part of that narrative. And then we need to understand like what could the protective factors be for that narrative, what is the helpful factor, etc. And then are there things that have been dismissed that are a part of that bigger system that we can address in therapy? So for instance, if you have a kid who is school refusal, right? School refusal hits 3 to 4 weeks into the school year. Typically it just gets really hard. Kids are like, I don't want to do it. They like know the lay of the land. There's nothing exciting anymore. School refusal falls. If we, as a provider team, are only discussing the concerns, the frustrations or whatever with the provider or with the parents, we're missing an entire narrative, an entire perspective of what's happening for that kid. And I think that there are assumptions, even sometimes that I can make. I can assume maybe that I understand where this kid is coming from. I can assume where like the parents are, but I want to understand the narrative, and the narrative can shift and grow. Just because school refusal happens in some kids a certain way in 7th grade, it doesn't mean that it's going to be the same for like a 10th grade school refusal. Part of understanding the narrative is also giving it the idea of a working narrative, right? Which means that situations, kids, families, shared narratives are allowed to evolve, right? No one likes being held accountable for their behavior when they were like 5, because we are different people. We're different people now than we were when we were 5, 6, 10, 15, name the name. name the age that you experience that with. And so I think it's really incredibly important to take into consideration the fact that like that shared narrative can shift and grow as you evolve as a teenager, as your kid evolves, as you evolve as a parent, and that all of those things are allowed to happen. We are allowed to have different perspectives. We are allowed to have different feelings about a situation. We are allowed to like add information into a narrative that shifts the way the narrative is. But again, the goal at the end of the day, especially when you're working with the family system, is like, how do we create a shared narrative that helps and promotes healing, collaboration, connection, relationship, positive attachment, consistency, stability, rapport, right? And it's such a beautiful process when you're able to do all of that within a family. And when you talk about like reliability as a parent, you also need to be ready to hear from your kid that you may not actually be as reliable as you think you are. And part of the shared narrative that's really cool is that nobody's narrative means more than someone else's, right? Sure, there are different like nooks and crannies, there's different influences, there's different impacts on certain storylines, but nobody means more than the other person. And so when we're talking about, you know, a previous conversation and people remember it differently, your teen is likely going to hold you accountable for that conversation and the fact that like you didn't actually say the thing you said you were going to do, right? And if your teen is bringing it up and saying like, you know, you said this, that's an interesting thing for you to remember, right? And to have the conversation about, get curious, right? To be like, do you remember what else we talked about in that situation? And like, why do you think that was the thing that like stuck out to you the most about what we had talked about? When we talk about narrative therapy, we talk about discussing a shared narrative, we're also kind of like externalizing it a little bit and allowing people to talk about it externally from themselves, which often makes people less defensive, especially teens in treatment. So when we're talking about it, I want people to be able to kind of have those really honest conversations, to hold people accountable, to talk about like their experience with certain things and to kind of like create that shared narrative. And again, even if it's not the same, right? Sometimes a shared narrative is a compilation of everyone's perspective and experiences of that situation, but they're all out in the open, right? Because you can open it, you can read it like a book, you can like recall it, you can talk about it, you can discuss it, you can pick apart the content, you can like have all of these like really amazing conversations in terms of like narrative processes, right? The way that you would discuss and analyze an English textbook is also the same way sometimes that you can discuss problems like that when you have the right feature set up, when you have the right structure set up, when there's like a shared desire to get on the same page and to like have a narrative that kind of makes sense for the family. And again, this pulls into the idea that when you have a teenager, right, you're not necessarily looking for like whether they're right or wrong, right? And I think that's where I come to think about this reliability piece is like, okay, like when we really assess reliability, what are we saying, right? And the way that I was first kind of given it was like, oh, like, are they reliable? Like, would they report something the way somebody else would, which then inherently means that there is a right or a wrong. And I can't tell you how many kids have the same experiences in their different scenarios, but report them entirely different. He was a PhD. He was one of my like professors. That's what I was looking for. He's one of my professors in grad school. Shout out to Dr. Curtin. He retired. He was amazing. Loved working with him. He was a very like knowledgeable human. But I remember sitting in class at some point. We were talking about, you know, different types of therapy, and we had talked about trauma. Trauma came up. And what's really interesting is that everybody, based on their genetics, their past history, their resiliency, their family support system, their perspective, glass half full, half empty, we experience situations differently. So what he had said, which I still remember to this day, is that roughly if you had a group of people that experienced a shared trauma, you would have a breakdown of 33%. So 33% would experience that trauma and would be totally fine, might talk about it to some friends, but they don't need kind of long-term help and support with it. You could say that that group is more resilient, but I might actually just say that they experienced it differently and had maybe the skills to deal with it in a different way, or like weren't triggered by previous things. Then you'd have 33% of the population that would need some sessions with a therapist and would need some help and support, but it wouldn't be long-term and it's not like life-altering, right? Then you'd have 33% that would be in therapy or seeking some sort of help and support long-term because of that experienced trauma. None of those things are wrong, but they're all different. And the way that we experience those things is all different, even though they're the same situation, right? They all went through the same situation. And so I think about the parenting piece, right? And the reliability piece, right? A reliable reporter is a huge deal in the mental health field, because obviously we want to ensure that we can understand the story and that they're being honest in their perspective. But I also think we have to take into account the fact that every perspective is different. So when you're trying to showcase a reliability piece with a teenager, and we're trying to assign who is more reliable in their reporting, and we're basically dismissing the person who's less reliable, we are then dismissing the potential opportunity for understanding where that person's perspective is and why they're reporting it the way that they did. So if you have a kid, for instance, who's like really struggling in school, super dysregulated, having a really hard time, there's lots of like messy back and forth. Kid is demanding I need this, etc. You could look at that through the behavior lens. You could look at that through the enabling lens. You could look at through separation anxiety potentially, or like a demand avoidance piece, right? But at the end of the day, we really have to look at what their narrative, what the behavior is saying, and then what that tells us about kind of the bigger picture, the shared narrative. I think that we sometimes do dismiss as a field how teens are feeling, what they're saying. We do push for saying, keep going, right? There's this air of toxic positivity that sometimes happens where when people are saying that something is really hard and they're having a really hard time, the response is keep doing it. You're doing great. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that toxic positivity is the same thing as toxic negativity, right? If everything is positive or everything is negative, we can't make space for the gray area. So when we're talking about a shared narrative, we're making space for the gray area. We are taking away the opportunity to be right or wrong, right? We are taking away the opportunity to assign blame and frustration, etc. in that conversation. We are opening up this gray area for people to really be honest and forthcoming and messy, right? And to really create a narrative that makes sense for the situation, the family, etc. And giving every voice an equal opportunity to come to the table and express those things. So the goal to me when I have a kid and I'm assessing for reliability as a reporter is really trying to also push them to understand where that report is coming from and why what they're reporting is important, what matters, why they pick up on that. And having other people understand too, that part of the narrative. So really not assuming or assigning, but just having the conversation and having the shared narrative. Because in a family system, it's, again, rarely that anyone is 100% right or wrong. And it's often about how do we navigate the gray in a way that allows for humanity and dignity and autonomy and decision-making, independence, etc. So there's a lot of things that kind of wrap up into this, but I do think it's one of my favorite ways to kind of help a family navigate difficult situations. And especially kind of writing down everything we know about a situation, about a problem, about previously offered solutions. I think talking about sometimes what we know helps create space and time and questions for how do we fix it, right? How do we work through it and navigate it, and how do we create healing and continued success and positive development in a way that makes sense. And I want to go back for a second because I do think I was talking about, my brain scattered for a second. I was talking about toxic positivity and, I guess toxic negativity, I think is what I had said. And the really interesting piece is that I think toxic positivity refuses the narrative that there is something that's challenging even in the face of success, right? So just because your teenager is being successful in something that they're aiming doesn't mean that it's not hard. And I think that there is this idea that like, we'll just keep pushing, we'll just keep saying they're doing great, we'll just keep cheerleading them, and like, you know, they won't fall apart. But I think the more honest thing that we could do is to continue to cheer them on in a way that makes sense, while also creating space for the times when they're going to fall apart and be a puddle on the floor. It absolutely happens. And I don't think it's fair to expect that just because they have straight A's, or just because they're winning all the gymnastics meets, or just because they're at the top of their sport, right? That they're not going to have those moments where they're just going to let down all of the barriers, all of the guards, all of the walls, and just like freaking fall apart. I think as a parent, one of our most important things, a parent and a provider, is not to tell a kid how they feel and to tell them what they should be doing, but to provide a process to process those emotions and to provide some structure into like how we work through really tough things. So if we think about that, we're more the guardrails than we are anything else. And sometimes we can be suggestive when we can talk about like, maybe you're feeling this, maybe that's a thing, right? But at the end of the day, it has to be something that the teen really resonates with and is like, yeah, like that feels likely to me. Because we never want to like assume a narrative. We never want to force a narrative. And I think that, you know, in the terms of being accepting of all narratives, we need to live in the gray, and we need to understand that like toxic positivity and just continuing to be the cheerleader without recognizing any of the stuff that's hard is not necessarily the way to do that. That's going to feel like the kid is really seen by you. So the next piece of this is that at the core of all of this, any human wants to be seen. Any of us. We want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to be acknowledged, we want our perspective, our feelings to matter. And when we are in a space where we are assuming a narrative and we are refusing their narrative and we are being toxically positive, whatever that saying would be, it really detracts from the kid feeling like they can have an honest narrative about the situation that they're in. And so there is a time and a place for cheerleading. There's a time and a place, you know, to like make an assumption that like maybe you kind of like are curious about, you explore, you like offer some support around, but then really at the end of the day, they still have to have an opinion, and you still need to be there to support them through that like very gray area of like, I know that I have straight A's and I know that I'm doing well, but I don't feel good and I don't, you know, like this, or my brain hurts, or my heart's tired, or like whatever those things are. Just because they're doing well in something doesn't mean that that something isn't hard and that they don't deserve support for doing a hard thing, even if they're being successful. So if you take anything away from this today, as a parent, as a provider, I'm hoping that you'll take a deeper look at your perspective and your responses to the teens that you either work with or the teens that you're parenting, and really get into the mindset of like allowing them to have a voice and a space to add to the narrative, right? To add their perspective into the narrative. And if you are someone who is like in family therapy and you're working on a bunch of different things with your teenager, I want you to get into the space of knowing that like there is no right or wrong in a shared narrative, and that you're all kind of like putting your perspectives together and working towards this like understanding of a bigger thing. And then please remember that kids want to be seen. Teens want to be seen. They want to be heard. And they can be great teammates and really, really great collaborators if you give them the time and the energy and the autonomy to do that. So when you're talking about reliability and reliable reporters, think about this and how you use it in your own practice, how you use it in like, you know, with your teen. And actually, I guess on a side note tangent, if you have a kid who is not in any way representing situations appropriately, or they're just so off base from like what you've seen, that is another question to ask, right? Not a jump to judgment, not a, oh my God, you're crazy, that's like terrible, like that is so wrong. it's really an opportunity for you to get curious about why that is the perspective they're reporting. So anyway, I hope this was helpful. I love talking about these kind of like little niche things with teens. I really hope that you got something out of this and that it gives you kind of further consideration for when we're talking about reliability and reporters. I would love any like feedback, comments you have. How do you think about reliable reporting? Do you have thoughts on toxic positivity? Anything that you want to share, I am all ears. But thank you so much for joining me today. I'll let you go for the day. Hopefully, I will catch you on the next episode of Teens No Cap. Once again, I'm your host, Charity Chafee. I had so much fun chatting with everyone today. I hope you have a